Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. The Institute for Feed Education and Research, IFEEDER, has released a set of life cycle assessment resources designed to help the animal feed and pet food industry best understand and navigate the LCA space, as well as identify opportunities where LCAs can be beneficial. Lara Mooday of IFEEDER, she's the executive director, joins us today with some details on these new tools. Welcome, Laura. Great to have you with us.
Hey, Sarah. Thanks for having me on today.
So, we're going to talk about sustainability, but before we get into these new resources and these new tools, let's have you start by talking about iFeeder. What is iFeeder? What role does it play in the animal food industry?
Yeah, so IFEEDER, started in 2009, is the Institute for Feed Education and Research. And we really are the research and education charity that supports the animal feed industry, particularly animal and pet food industry, in particular here in the US, but we also work with many stakeholders in Canada and in Europe and in other locations. But our general effort is to advance the understanding and trust in sustainable animal feed and pet food for around research and education.
So, where would you say that the animal feed and the pet food industry, where are they at in their sustainability journey? Are we just getting started? Are we well along in it? What's kind of your perception on that?
So the industry, like many other industries, we're a vast industry in that we have multinational, publicly traded companies that are engaging globally in Europe and other locations. And then we have a lot of smaller regional organizations that haven't, for whatever reason, had to take that step yet. And so we have folks across the whole spectrum, which is one of the reasons we've been creating these resources, is because we have this broad spectrum. And so the folks that are multinational, publicly traded companies, they're paying attention to what's happening in the EU relative to the regulations and directives that are over there. They're paying attention to the potential regulation in California with regard to carbon reporting. They're responding to the various indexes like CDP and GRI that are evaluating sustainability of these companies and their data sets that they're submitting. Then we have these other regional folks who haven't had to engage at that level yet. And so they're just responding really as they see the need to within their own organizations, their own strategies, or in many cases, what their customers are starting to ask of them. And so there's more and more happening in the space because some of their downstream stakeholders or their customers are starting to ask these questions of them. And this is what's driving them to start thinking more in this space.
So you mentioned these new resources. Let's get into those a little bit and start with talking to us about what led to the development of these resources and what value do they have for the animal food industry?
Yeah, I'm wondering if it would be best if I pull in the presentation a little bit and speak a little bit to how we started creating the content, particularly around life cycle assessments. And so from an industry perspective, because of where we are in our journey, the industry members are either responding strategically to what they're doing within their own organizations, they're responding to what their customers are asking of them, or they're responding to regulatory pressure. We knew this. We knew that there's been an increased frequency of the amount of questions that either AFIA or me within IFEEDER are getting around life cycle assessments. We also had an advisory group of industry members that have been supporting IFEEDER in the space that encouraged us to do a little bit more here. So as part of the resources that we created, one of the things we did was a survey of members that are either currently or not currently completing LCAs, because we wanted both perspectives. And the drivers there really, again, these three buckets of what are we doing strategically within our organization? Are we trying to understand, do we just want to understand if there's additional value in the product, or do we want to have a benchmark for what the environmental footprint of our product development is? Or is it that we have a customer that's asking us this question? So this is a growing thing that's happening. We have downstream customers that are starting to ask about the footprints of particular ingredients. And so we have folks that are trying to figure out how to respond to what their customers' needs are. Or as I talked a little bit about the regulatory pressure, we have things like the product environmental footprint reporting requirements that are coming up in Europe around the EU Green Deal that are requiring folks to have footprint information if they want to export into Europe. And so these things are driving this space, and it's why we thought now is a great time to create some resources that our industry members could have.
You mentioned customers, and some of the customers are starting to ask a lot more questions. Is there a certain type of customer that's coming in to ask about what your life cycle assessment looks like and the impact that you have?
In some cases, it's the customers that are sitting closer to the consumer. And so we frequently see the questions coming from pet food companies that are asking questions about the ingredients that are going into pet food because they're more directly linked to the consumer. And then the other customer base would be the livestock sector, but those questions are really coming from I would say, the animal organizations or the animal sectors as a whole. So more and more, those sectors are trying to understand their footprints and put some benchmarks in place or identify what achievements they've made across like a particular animal production region or across the US. And they've realized that feed in particular has the most uncertainty around the footprint. And not only does feed have the most uncertainty, but feed also is a big piece of the footprint. And so those customers then are also trying to understand where feed sits and ways where the hotspots are, right, where they can start to make changes.
So then talk to us about what all goes into the development of an LCA. How do you go about figuring all of that out since there is so much variation?
Well, I think a starting place is to just ask, like, what do we get out of an LCA? And like, we haven't really defined it, although you've probably defined it in other interviews that you've done through this platform. But an LCA is a life cycle assessment. And essentially, it is a measuring of the environmental footprint of a product or its environmental impact. It could be that you're only interested in the carbon piece. For a long time, that's where a lot of the focus on LCAs were, on carbon. But depending on where you're located, you may want to know your water footprint if water scarcity is a challenge. Or we have a lot of European members that are interested in, or a lot of European stakeholders that are interested in land use. And so they want to understand the land use footprint of a product. And so environmental footprint is broad. Sometimes it only means carbon, sometimes it means beyond that. Then when we think about the scope of a life cycle assessment and we're using it to quantify the effects or the impacts, we also have to think about the boundaries we're drawing around it. Are we only interested in the production, the footprint around the production of the product? Like if you're thinking about something like distillers grains, it's the cultivation of the corn. That's part of the footprint. It's the movement of the corn to the processing facility. That's part of the footprint. And then also it's the handling of the processing of the corn relative to some of it going to ethanol and some of it coming to distillers grains. So your boundary could be the production of the product at the time it leaves the ethanol plant. Or we could draw the boundary a little bit bigger and we could say, well, let's also look at the animals consuming of it. And then what's the impact of the animal consuming the distillers grains? And so that could be a part of the footprint. And so it really can be variable based on what boundaries you draw. And so there you're thinking about the product's life cycle, right? Is it just the production of it or does it go beyond that? And so the outcomes of an LCA, for an industry member thinking about doing an LCA, they have to ask these questions of themselves about what is it that we're trying to represent? Do we just want to represent the product or do we want to represent the use of the product as well? And what is it that our customer's asking? And so there are many decisions to be made depending on what your desired outcome is.
You have some new resources in the toolkit that folks
Certainly.
Can take a look at. What are those all about?
Yeah, so IFEEDER, in part of the engagement with the industry, when we were talking to folks that have completed LCAs and have not completed LCAs, we also were assessing what their needs were, or what findings or experiences they might want to convey to others that are new to the space. And so as a result of that, we created a set of 5 resources that we've now added to IFEEDER's sustainability toolkit. And those resources include, number one, just an overview of the LCA process. There's something called the ISO organization, and they have standards, and there is a standard for doing life cycle assessments and how it helps dictate how those are carried out. So we take a dive into that and just an understanding of how LCAs could be used. And then, like anything, LCAs have their own terminology. And so we created a glossary that folks can use. Like if you're new to the space, just understand when you hear maybe a consultant that you're choosing to work with ask you some questions about, hey, do you have this secondary data, or do you have this primary data, or do you have this background data or foreground data? Like, what does that mean? And so the LCA glossary is meant to help people as they're engaging and communicating in the space. A lot of folks ask, what's the status of the industry, right? You asked that question a little bit. And so there's another section of it that's based on some survey work that provides insights to where the industry is on LCAs. And then once you maybe have made the decision to undertake an LCA, how do you map it out for your team? What kind of things should you be considering? And so we put in a decision tree to help with internal discussions. And then finally, we put in a landscape map and profiles. One of the things that I get a lot of questions about are, hey, Laura, we want to do an LCA. Can you point us to a consultant that can help us with this? Well, that's a hard question for me to answer, but it's something that our members need help with. And so we created a set of profiles of practitioners in the space. So now you can just go to that. It's perhaps not inclusive. We're happy to add more folks to that space, but that's what we have there. And if you'll allow me, I thought I'd just take a little dive into what some of those look like that people might be interested in. So for the decision tree, we said, if you have these it's basically built around 4 areas to help teams work through it. So the first place is just understanding like what your intention is around it and what value does it bring? Like, what's the opportunity? Why would you undertake this? We're about to have to commit some resources to this. What's the potential return that I can get from this? So the first kind of discussion that you have with your team is like, are we committed to doing this and why? Second, when you start thinking about committing to it, are you going to hire somebody to do it as a consultant? Are you going to do it internally? Do you have team members to help you with that? How much time is it going to take? And so part of the decision tree looks at the time commitment, and then prioritizing your desired outcomes, and then steps, questions to take when considering the execution. And so just to give an idea of what that looks like, so there's a decision tree, there's content for people to walk through, and they can take that time to sit down with their teams and focus on that. And then the other piece that I thought I'd just show you really quick is this life cycle assessment kind of mapping and profiles. And so this is a bit of a mapping of things that you would be considering in a life cycle assessment, from the standards and regulations that are dictating what you're doing to where you're gathering some of your background data from in the life cycle assessment inventory, to the software you choose to use, to the practitioners, as I mentioned. And then beyond that, each of them dives in and provides a set of profiles for the various areas that are in there. So it can help you make some selections on exactly what you want to do and who you might want to work with. So that's the type of information that's available in the resource.
Lots of great information and a great resource. So where can folks go to find this information, and is there a cost associated with that? How does that work?
So IFEEDER has a web page that we updated last year so that people can easily navigate to find the information. If you go to ifeeder.org, on the main landing page right now, there is a link to the lifecycle assessment resources. If you are a member of the American Feed Industry Association, or if you've contributed to the work that we've done, then you can have that toolkit for free. So essentially, the LCA resources live within IFEEDER's Animal Feed Industry Sustainability Toolkit. And you can download that from the website. If you are not an AFIA member, then you can go to AFIA's publications page, and for $900, I think you can access the whole toolkit, which includes not only this information, but a whole host of other resources that we've been building in the last year and a half that are within there.
A lot of progress has been made, and I know you've been working hard on developing these new resources. So what's next for iFeeder in this area? What's your next goal? Are there things you're working on?
Yeah, so data is an important piece in the sustainability discussion and an understanding of what's going on in the across the industry. So two things that we have underway right now is the pet food report and the feed ingredient consumption report. Those will be available in January. We'll be rolling information out on those at the International Production and Processing Expo in Atlanta. The pet food report is going to be looking at trends of ingredient use within the pet food industry and just general trends for pet food sales. And then the feed ingredient consumption report will be looking at 48 different ingredients and their use across different animal species by state. And you might say, what do those have to do with sustainability, Lara? Well, interestingly, I just came across somebody at the Sustainable Ag Summit 2 weeks ago in Minneapolis who said, hey, Lara, we've been using iFeeder's information as the exact resource we needed to work with the state of Minnesota as they're trying to do some footprint analysis and understanding what materials to include in their footprints for their livestock production systems. And we came across that report and it's the exact data we needed. And so these pieces, we use them not only for the industry in our conveying our message, but those data sets are important for the work that we're doing in quantifying the footprint of animal agriculture and feed in particular.
That's always neat to hear how someone's using the information
Right.
to things you maybe hadn't thought about. And we'll look forward to catching up with you down in Atlanta at
Yeah,
IPPE to
absolutely.
get some more information. Final thoughts to leave our audience with here today, Laura?
Well, my final thought is always iFeeder. We do work on behalf of the animal feed and pet food industry, and we are a nonprofit. So we are a 501c3. And all of the work we do is done through contributions from industry members, from stakeholders, or from grants and awards. And so if the work that we're doing speaks to you, I'd love to talk to you about being a supporter or contributor to iFeeder, or you can go to ifeeder.org and there's a real easy way to donate.
Very good. Lara Mooday of iFeeder, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing the information on this valuable resource for the industry.
Thanks so much, Sarah.
And our thanks for all of you for tuning in. A reminder, all Feedstuffs 365 interviews are available online at Feedstuffs. Until next time, for Feedstuffs 365, I'm Sarah Muirhead.